the magnificent apse mosaic in the Basilica of Apollinare in Classe, just outside Ravenna, is one of the amazing mosaics from the early Christian centuries that were sent to have inspired Dante, particularly in the writing of the latter stages of the Purgatory and then the Paradiso, because he was in exile in Ravenna at that point in the early 14th century. And you can see why. The apse mosaic depicts the Transfiguration of Christ, showing Christ in an abstract symbolic form across, surrounded by a circle and stars. And this reminds scholars of Dante's encounter in the heaven of Mars, where he sees the cross of Christ full of the stars of the saints, and it's the particular moment that he encounters his great-great-great-grandfather, Caccia Guida, who shoots down one of the arms of the cross and converses with him about his own sacrifice that Dante must make in exile. And then you can also see in the apse image the wildlife, the forests, the fauna, the flora of earth meeting the golden light of the heavens. And this might remind readers of the Divine Comedy of the earthly Eden, the point at which Dante encounters Beatrice for the first time and then begins his transhumanization and enters the golden light of paradise, leaving the earthly Eden behind. That meeting point is depicted in the apse, and maybe Dante was inspired in his own description. But when you start to think about it and look again, you also see how radical Dante is in this use of the ancient imagery. In the apse mosaic, in the Basilica of Apollinare in Classe, you find an assertion of church authority. The image is of the Transfiguration, Christ in the cross. In the golden sphere above appear Elijah and Moses, and then you see the three sheep, which symbolically represent Peter, James, and John, receiving the new dispensation. And that is transmitted to the central human figure in the apse mosaic of Apollinare, who was said to be a disciple of Peter and was buried on the site of the basilica. And that transmission from Peter to Apollinare, one of the first bishops, is then passed to the four figures you see beneath the dome, behind curtains, and they are four important bishops of Ravenna. And indeed, this basilica is about the reassertion of orthodoxy after the Arian period that existed in Ravenna, showing that Jesus wasn't made God, but was from God, was begotten by God, hence coming out from the hand of God at the peak of the apse, down through the heavens into the earthly sphere. And then that message, that truth of orthodoxy being passed into the church of Ravenna in the figure of its patron saint and the bishops. It's a reassertion of the Orthodox faith after the Arian period. And when you set that against what Dante does with this image, if it's true that it inspired him, you see what a radical remaking he is doing again. Because in the Divine Comedy, it's not the Transfiguration of Christ that is the meeting point of heaven and earth. And it's not Christ that Dante encounters face to face in the heaven of Mars in the round circular cross. Rather, This is about his own transfiguration, his own transhumanization on the top of Mount Purgatory, in the Garden of Eden, with its beautiful forests and its rivers and its life that springs directly from God. Dante meets Beatrice and she prepares him for this transfiguration, for the transition from the earthly spheres into the heavenly spheres and ultimately into the Imperium itself. And then in the Heaven of Mars, when Dante encounters Caccia Guida, it is his relative who comes from the cross to speak to him and tell him about how he must take up a cruciform shape in his life through his exile, sacrificing everything in that he might gain everything, which he then writes about in the Divine Comedy. And so Dante is placing himself where Christ was originally depicted. The followers of Christ now aren't like the sheep in the apse mosaic, looking up and receiving this divine life, which transcends them. Rather, Dante is being drawn into that divine life and discovering it in himself. So whilst it is wonderful to look at these ancient mosaics, particularly in the Basilica of Apollinare in Classe, and to feel how Dante might too have gazed at the dazzle, the light, the effulgence, the glitter, the beautiful colours, the balance, the inspiration. It's also tremendous to think about how he remakes that for himself. This isn't about an assertion of church authority in the Divine Comedy, as the Basilica originally was built to assert. This is about the discovery by an individual of their own transformation, the realization that the truth of the incarnation is that the human and the divine meets in us all, seen in the life of Christ, and transmitted not so much through these bishops, but straight into our own lives. That is the heart of the message of the Divine Comedy that Dante hopes to communicate to us, inspired by all the beauty which he saw around him in Ravenna.